while you're there, you can just live stream it on YouTube, and because I imagine watching cars being repaired is very exciting. And we can always cut out the beginning. So just, yeah, if you just start it now, it'll be fine.
Okay, you're live streaming now.
Yeah. Hey, Greg, how are you?
You can actually, unmute Greg if you want. Have someone talk to.
Nobody's muted without their consent.
I muted everybody already when I logged in earlier,
Okay.
and I also put a security measures.
Okay.
Yeah, because last time we had a lot of fun, let's just say.
Oh, you mean the first Armenia presentation, or?
Oh, actually, everybody's unmuted. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's weird. Okay, fine. You want to keep it that way, but let me just change the security where people can rename themselves at least.
Yes, please do that.
We're going to be. Okay, I'm going to tell them that, and also I'm going to stop the videos. Whoever logged in, it's fine. We'll ask them kindly to mute, but everybody else is going to now come in muted, okay?
Somebody's asking if there's closed captioning. There is no closed captioning. Unfortunately, because this is being done live, I don't know how to, if there's a way to activate that through Zoom, please let me know. The only thing that I suspect is that in a lot of cases, the names that I'm using and the places that I'm using are going to be rather complicated. So it's probably not like whatever, if there's an automated system, it'll probably get us wrong. And as for part one, I will put the link to part one in the box. We had it last week, and so those who are here from last week would be familiar with it. Those who are not, yeah.
Just made Robert the co-host. Hi, Robert.
Armenian Highlands, and they began to settle there. So this is the link for part one. Hey, good evening, everybody. Nice to see you, Patty.
Sorry,
right.
I had to mute.
Yeah, no. I know I said thank you, and then you muted me. So, it all works out. I guess with the amount of people we have, if you'd like to say something, please raise your hand, and then I will unmute you, or Zach will unmute you. So if you want to talk, if you want to just leave a message in the chat, I do check the chat. So please feel free to leave me a message there. Chat will remain open, um, as far as I can tell. And we're going to start in about 6 minutes. Give people a few more minutes to come in. Alex, I just want to ask you, which Armenian church is that behind you?
Uh, that's actually a new church that was built. Uh, oh, I photographed that about and it's in the province of southwestern, southeastern. Uh, I had, I lived and worked in Armenia for 10 years, and I, returned to the U.S. about 2.5 years ago, and finally retired. And during that time, I photographed as many of the old Armenian churches as I could, and I put together a small book,
Oh, that's
on
phenomenal.
maybe about 20 or 30 of them. But there are thousands of old Armenian churches, and the ruins in some cases, and in many cases, churches that are still in use. So it was quite interesting, to say the least.
Thanks. Alicia, I see that you have your hand raised. I'm trying to unmute you if you'd like to say something.
Hi, how are you?
Hi, how are you?
Fine. I was very interested to join you. It's my first time meeting you all. And I'm Armenian, so this really touches my heart. And I'm willing to listen, and hopefully we'll learn something new about my history.
Well,
So
I hope I can do it justice. I'm not Armenian. So there might be a little bit of outsider perspective here.
mhm.
But I hope you enjoy it nonetheless.
Yes, thank you for doing this. Thank you so much. It means a lot.
Yeah, and I echo what Robert says. It's really great. I see Alex is here, Alicia is here. There's several other names that are um, pretty clearly Armenian. So it's really nice to have the community supporting us.
Um,
With a last name
Great.
like
Alex, can you increase your microphone a little bit?
I'm sorry?
It's a little hard to hear you.
Oh, I say, with a last name like Sassoon, yeah, I thought you were obviously Armenian.
No, if it was Sasunian, I would be Armenian, but no,
Yeah.
Sassoon is a Jewish name.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. No, like I remember when I was very young and I saw the Battle of Sassoon and I was like, does that have anything to do with my family? And of course not. You know, it's something very, very different.
So there are a number of names that are used both by Armenians, and Jews. Sassoon, I was not aware of. Aharon is one that I know is a Jewish name as well as an Armenian name.
Yeah. All right. Sippy, I saw that there was a comment from you saying that did you want to say something or were you just commenting on how you're muted at the moment?
Can you hear me?
We can.
Oh, the other gentleman's voice seems muted. I want
Yes,
them
no,
here.
everybody is muted, but if you raise your hand, you use the raise your hand feature or you write a comment, I'm more than happy to unmute you. The thing is that of course a lot of people don't naturally mute themselves, and then we hear all kinds of fun and exciting noises from the background. I remember a presentation I gave some time ago, and my friend attended, and she said, "You know what I remember? Two people were throwing toilet paper across the room." And I said, that's probably the most important part of what I was talking about that day. So, well done. Um, sure. And nice to see you, Beverly. Zach, can you make Rob a co-host? Hi, Leslie.
Hi, Richard. There's another fascinating Zoom going around that is the history of two Jewish families in China.
Yeah, the
And
Sassoons and the
one of them
Kaduris.
is the Sassoons, right? It's fascinating. I loved watching it.
Yeah, no, it's a different side of my family, but yeah, no, those two families are very famous, especially in Baghdadi Jewish circles, and even more widely because of how they contributed to the British imperialist effort in China, especially in Shanghai.
Glad to hear that you know about it. Thanks.
It'd be kind of awkward if I didn't. All right. Um, okay. So I'm going to start. Welcome to the 23rd in our Middle Eastern Islamic History series. This series goes all the way back to July of 2021, and we've had an episode every week covering from what does Islam stand for to the development of the Rashidun Caliphate, the Umayyads, the Abbasids, the Turkic groups like the Seljuks, and we got up to the point of Selim the Grim and the Safavid Empire, when we're going to do a retrospective and just cover the Armenians from the ancient period through to the medieval period, where we had ended with Selim the Grim and the Safavids. Hopefully the uh, people will be able to see the past presentations and compare them. Hopefully, we'll be able to get to all the medieval stuff that we want to do today. Unfortunately, if the scope covers up until the year 1650 or so, so most of the modern Armenian history, in particular the genocides and the modern Republic of Armenia, the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, those will not be covered today. But trust me, we have more than enough history to get us through 2 amazing hours. So um, the rules for those of you who are less familiar with what I do. So the first one is that this is not an academic presentation. I'm not accredited in history, language, philosophy, theology, Armenian studies, anything similar to that. I'm a lawyer by trade, and this is just something that I have a passion about, Middle Eastern history and that world. And I'm going to give this from a secular sort of overbroad perspective, meaning that I'm going to try as best as I can to look at the history just as history, without coming to it from a pro-Armenian bias or an anti-Armenian bias. Just this is the history of the Armenian people. But of course, we need to be respectful. This is obviously an important and delicate matter. So Will Wheaton's rule certainly applies. And that said, this is not me shouting at a computer, or it shouldn't be. I would love questions, comments, clarifications. So if you put something in the chat, if you raise your hand, I'm more than happy to answer the question. And you should do it while I'm giving the presentation. You shouldn't wait till the end of the presentation. If there's something that I'm going to cover in the future, I'll just tell you, and that'll be fine. I love questions and comments. And that's part of how I designed this class. I designed it as a 101 and a 201, which means that if you don't know anything, I'll try and catch you up. And if you know something already, I hope that I'll be able to add another layer, something that you didn't know, something more esoteric. And this class will have a 2 hour hard stop, which means that whatever we don't get to in 2 hours from now, that's it. We're not going to do any further slides. I'll still answer questions. I'll still answer questions. I'll still talk about some of the issues, but I won't go to any new slides. You won't miss any new material. You know that we have sort of an agreement that after 2 hours we're done, and that's cool. Yeah. And of course, the final rule, thank you, Valerie, is that this is recorded just like all the other entries into the Middle Eastern History Group series, and you're free to watch it at your own disposition. It's being live streamed on YouTube as well. So if you want that portability, you can switch there. And without further ado, everybody who's been here before, this is their favorite part, the quiz, to see what you remembered from being here last time. So the first question, which of the following characterizes Urartu Bienili? Choose all that apply. And feel free to raise your hand or to put your answer in the chat. This is a choose all that apply, so there should be multiple answers that are correct. All right. D is definitely one of the ones that's correct. Yeah, everybody can guess. And if you're new, you can guess too. Like, F is absolutely correct as well. B and D are correct. The only one we're missing is E, right? B, D, E, and F are all correct answers, right? It was a confederation in the Armenian highlands composed of many different ethnicities. The dominant ethnicity was Ahurian people for the majority of the period, but the Armenians were definitely part of that society. And there are documents from the period that refer to Urartu Bienili as Armenia. So there's definitely a presence of Armenians, if not the dominant group. It was rich in mineral wealth and exported copper, silver, gold, iron, and many other minerals. They had their own vineyards and their own unique wines, which they still have to this day. And they were famous for the breeding of horses. They also built large defensible fortresses at the edges of their territory. One of those edges was Erebuni, the modern city of Yerevan, which is the capital of post-Soviet Armenia. And that's the term that I'm going to use for the modern Republic of Armenia. Yeah. And of course, they had their own unique pantheon. So, question number 2. Which of the following describes what happened to Armenia in the 300s BCE? I have one guess, which is B. B is the wrong century, so that's not correct. Yes, answer C is correct. Nice going, Beverly. So yes, it started as an immediate Achaemenid satrapy that rebelled for a few years, right? We were talking about the Great Satraps Revolt in 360 BCE, and then they gained independence in the wake of the Diadochi Wars, which occurred after Alexander conquered the Persian Empire in the 330s BCE. So by 321 BCE, King Orontes II declared the independent Armenian kingdom that was one of the first Armenian states. The answer D is a little bit further in history, and so is answer A. Okay, question number 3. Which of the following best describes King Tiridates III? Is it A, he was originally a believer in Armenian Zoroastrianism and discriminated against Christians, but eventually converted to Christianity and discriminated against others? Is it B, he was deeply opposed to Roman Emperor Diocletian and allied with the Sasanians to repel him from Armenian territory? C, he was a relatively weak ruler, allowing the Armenian state to collapse and leading to the institution of the Marzban? Or D, he was a powerful conqueror, extending the Armenian control all the way to the Mediterranean Sea? And Catherine answered A, so did Winifred. We're getting a lot of A here. That is exactly correct. He was originally a polytheist who converted to Christianity and deeply discriminatory of whatever religion he was not at the time. Okay, question number 4. Which three of the following statements about the Mars Planet are true? The Marsban, yes, it is true that Armenia was the first nation to declare itself a Christian nation. Yeah. So, A, the Marsban maintained its own personal military, and the Sassanids never provided any additional soldiers or forces to protect the Marsban. B, the Marsban was a political office appointed by the Sassanians. C, the Nakharars or Armenian nobles were responsible for the overthrow of the Arsacid kings and the creation of the Marspanate. D, Shah Yazdegerd II was incredibly supportive of Armenian Christianity, as evidenced by his strong approval for the Council of Seleucia Ctesiphon. E, the Nakharars or Armenian nobles were incredibly supportive of the Marspanate. Or F, during the time of the Marspanate, Armenians led by the Mamikonians fought for the right to believe in Christianity and finally gained it in the Treaty in Varsak. If you guess, you have a 50-50 shot of being right. F is definitely correct. Nice job, Beverly. Let's see if we can get the other two answers. D was a trick answer of mine. Shah Yazdegerd II approved of the Church of the East, the Nestorian Church, and that's what he did in the Council of Seleucia Ctesiphon. But since the Armenian Apostolic Church was a different church from that church, it was not well respected. And Yazdegerd II performed many massacres against the Armenians. A is also not correct. That was a tricky one that I put there. The Marsban always required soldiers from the Sassanids in order to rule effectively. So the answers are B, the Marsban was a political office appointed by the Sassanids, and C, the Nakharars or Armenian nobles were responsible for the overthrow of the kings and the creation of the Marspanate. They asked the Sassanids to overthrow their king, the last Arsacid king. They believed that he was making rules that opposed their will and desires as individual nobles. But it turned out that the solution was worse than the problem which it's intended to solve. And as soon as the Marspanate was created, they realized just how wrong they had been to invite the Sassanids to take power. And then, of course, F, as we pointed out, was the response was that the Nakharars, led by Mamikonian, fought against the Sassanids for the right to believe their own faith. And yes, the on the question that's going on in the chat, yes, the Armenians declared Christianity as the official state religion in the year 301. The Romans wouldn't declare Christianity as the state religion for another decade or so. So now within the Roman Empire, it's estimated that at this time, maybe 8 to 10% of Roman citizens were Christian, and that's all across the empire. But it was not the case that in the empire, that in the Roman Empire, when Tiridates made Christianity the official religion of Armenia, that Roman was Christian. And also, as we pointed out, the church in the Roman Empire was the unified church, the one that would eventually become the split between Orthodox and Catholics and Protestants. All that's part of the unified church. The Armenians were part of Oriental Orthodoxy, which rejected the Fourth Council, which I guess I'm giving away the answer to the next question. But I have a question here. Why did the Armenians accept Christianity before everyone else? Tiridates III accepted Christianity. The apocryphal story from the Armenian church is that Gregory the Illuminator was a Christian, and we talked about this in the first session, who was brought before Tiridates III and cured him of an ailment. And so Tiridates III was convinced that Christianity was the one true religion and converted his entire country. There is likely a degree to which Tiridates also saw a political advantage by being Christian against the Sasanians, who were Zoroastrian, and allowed them to make a clear break with the Sasanians in terms of political power. So there's probably a mix of both reasons. Within Rome, the conversion to Christianity is much less clear. There are different reasons. It's spread among the soldiers. It's spread among some of the poorer populations. King Constantine was also on his deathbed when he converted. Emperor Constantine, sorry, was on his deathbed when he converted. There's a lot of different things going on. So anyway, the Armenian Apostolic Church broke with the Catholic Church, or the Unified Church, under which of the following circumstances? The Armenians did not agree with the claim of hypostatic union, that Jesus was divine in the womb, proposed by the Council of Ephesus in 431. Armenians did not agree with the claim of diophysitism, that Jesus has two natures that were differentiable but unified, proposed in the Council of Chalcedon in 451. The Armenians did not agree with the Catholic claim that Rome was the primary see and the other cities of the Pentarchy were subordinates in 1054. The Armenians refused to add the Filioque language appended by the Roman Catholic Church to the Nicene Creed. And since I basically gave the answer about a second ago, the answer is B. That's right. The answer is B. They did not agree with diophysitism. I made the joke last time that it's the saltwater Jesus versus the oil slick Jesus, right? In unified church thought, Jesus has two distinct natures, his divine nature and his human nature, and they are combined in some way to create Jesus's complete nature. But at a fundamental level, these are differentiable entities. The Armenians disagreed and said that Jesus's human nature and Jesus' divine nature, although they were separate entities, could not be differentiated and were just so mixed that it would be impossible to tear it apart. Yes, and Patrick, you're correct. The philosophy in opposition to diaphysitism is miaphysitism, although the detractors of miaphysitism called it monophysitism. Anyway, not very important. It's just important to know that they separated. So last time we talked about Armenia as a historic region. And so when I say Armenia, I'm not referring to the current Republic of Armenia. That's a very small part of the historic land that used to be Armenia. And it was this land in the highlands. You can see on the map on the lower left-hand side that Armenia is actually a very small piece of the modern, of that area that was part of that Armenian highlands, that raised area where Armenian confederations were. I have a question. All the Eastern churches rejected the Filioque, but the Oriental Orthodox churches, like the Armenian Church, like the Assyrian Church of the East, like the Ethiopian Church, didn't even address the Filioque controversy because they had already broken from the Unified Church before this was a controversy. So while Eastern Orthodoxy rejected it in name, Oriental Orthodoxy didn't have to because they weren't part of the Unified Church. But if we look, yeah, so if we continue on the map, right, that's one of the things that we sort of addressed, is that Armenia is this unified area that's now divided between Turkey, the country of Iran today, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. All these three countries have parts of historic Armenia. And we also mentioned that the Armenians had four different large kingdoms. These four different large kingdoms, we addressed two of them last time, right? We talked about Artaxid Armenia and Arsacid Armenia. But today we're going to hopefully talk about Bagratid Armenia and Rubenid Armenia, which are the next two major Armenian countries. I have a question as to whether the Armenian Apostolic Church is close to Nestorianism, and I would say that it's close in the sense that the two of these churches were separate from the Unified Church, but the Nestorian Church broke away in the Third Ecumenical Council, the Council of Ephesus of 431, and the Armenian Apostolic Church broke away in the Council of Chalcedon in 451. So the Armenians still considered the Nestorian Church to be a heresy. They just, because their break was later. And the two churches have not been united in any synod. Yes, exactly. I have a comment. The Nestorians believe that Mary bore the human Christ, meaning that when Christ was in the womb, there was no hypostatic union, right? Christ was not himself God until the birth moment. Okay. So I'm I'm unclear. Oh, yes. So these four countries were at different points in time. These were countries that were ruled by Armenians. And with the exception of Artaxid Armenia at this largest extent, the majority of their population were Armenians. So if you look at the time frame, these are in succession different kingdoms run and majoritarily personified by Armenians. So that's why there's four Armenias. And if you look in the center, you have the modern Armenian coat of arms, which recognizes these four historic Armenian countries as being part of the history of Armenia. Does that sort of answer the question, Leslie? Well, we're going to talk about the Great House of Cilicia, so stay tuned. So last time we addressed Urartu Bianili, right? We talked about this sort of kingdom. You can see it's right in the heartland of Armenia. And when I say Armenia, I'm referring to this large area. I'm not referring to post-Soviet Armenia. So in today's borders, this composes parts of Turkey, parts of Iran, parts of Armenia, parts of Azerbaijan. So you've got this country, and as we pointed out, they're renowned for their horses, for their iron, and they eventually become a satrap within the Persian Empire. That satrap eventually achieves independence and achieves its greatest military success under their king Tigranes II the Great, who conquers all the way to Judea, and makes a number of different countries either vassals or direct annexed territories. He would lose this territory very quickly to the Romans through the Mithridatic Wars. We then saw Armenia sitting, the Arsacid Kingdom of Armenia, sitting as sort of an intermediate state between the Romans in the west and the Parthians in the east. They were generally in the Roman sphere, but they still maintained a certain level of relations with the Parthians. We then talked about King Tiridates and his conversion to Christianity and how this resulted in a new change for Armenian policy. We then talked about 100 years, 150 years later, Tiridates' kingdom, the Arsacid Kingdom of Armenia, was overthrown when the Nakharar, or Armenian nobles, petitioned the Sasanians to overthrow the kingdom and institute the Marzban, which was this governor who would sit in the city of Dvin. And this governor would be responsible for Armenia. Now, one of the things to notice on this map, right, is that we have something labeled as Persian Armenia. And that's because the Armenian territories have now been split between the Byzantine Empire in the west and those that are under Persian suzerainty in the east. And something that we should always bear in mind is that there's a very fluid definition of independence that we're going to be using throughout this period. There are all kinds of things on the way from being a province of a larger empire to being a completely independent entity. So sometimes you have a province, sometimes you have an autonomous province, sometimes you have a vassal state, sometimes you have a tributary state, sometimes you have a completely independent state. And Armenia and a lot of the smaller countries in this region, like Albania, like Shirvan, like Iberia, like Colchis, like Imereti, all of these Caucasian states will be moving in and out of these states of quasi-independence throughout the following period that we're going to get into, and still to this day. I mean, today, nobody would say that they're a vassal, but there are definitely claims by post-Soviet Armenians that they've become a vassal of Russia. So there is a certain degree to which this even still continues. We then talked about the Armenian sort of fight for independence and self-identity from the Marzpanate, right? The Marzban was ruling in Dvin, and the Nakharars, these Armenian nobles, wanted to assert power against them. One of the clearest ways to do this was through religious war, right? So you have the situations where, for example, Merzurhan Artsruni, he was executed by Christian Nakharars for being an unapologetic Zoroastrian and being a supporter of the Persians. Then on the flip side, we have situations like King Arshak II, who was an Armenian ruler before the creation of the Marsban, who had been taken by the Sassanids and put in the Fortress of Oblivion. And King Arshak killed himself because he was unable to express his Christian faith. And Drastamat, an Armenian who came to visit him, committed suicide upon seeing his king do the same. I have a question about how were citizens impacted by the instability of the rulership. You have to understand that these revolts, these revolts if you're looking at it over the course of a century, they're happening very often. If you're looking at it as a day-to-day event, it's not that disruptive in this sense, right? What ends up becoming much more disruptive is when you have large-scale invasions, and we're going to see some of those today. But the rebellions of the Nakharars against the Marspanet are individualistic crusades that are usually hundreds, if not thousands of people. We're not talking about great battles like the Battle of Avarear, which is sort of a once in a while kind of activity. And speak of the devil. So the Battle of Avarear is in 451, right? We talked about this, and it pitted Vardan Mamikonian, who was one of these Nakharars, with a number of Armenians who wanted to freely practice Christianity against the Sasanians, who were increasingly being repressive towards that. And the Battle of Avarear was a major defeat for the Armenians in the sense that tactically they were completely destroyed. In particular, the Sasanians had used war elephants, and the Armenians did not know how to respond to this kind of attack. However, because the Persians had problems on their eastern borders, on what's now Afghanistan, right? There, in Afghanistan and in Turkmenistan, there were these Hephthalites who were a kind of Hunnic people. The Hephthalites had gone to war with the Persians, and the Persians needed Armenian support in order to put down the Hephthalites. And so they signed the Treaty of Nabarsak, which recognized Armenian Apostolic Church as an official recognized religion within within Persian Armenia. And this forever granted, as long as the Sasanians were in power, the Armenians the ability to build churches and to worship the Christianity that they saw fit. And you can see in the below Vahan Mamikonian, from the same family but not the same person, signing the Treaty of Navarsak in the city of Devin, right? We remember the city of Devin is where the Marspanet is headquartered. So this is exactly where the Persian emissaries would meet him. And then we talked about the schisms in the church. We'll get into that a little bit more later, but this is where we left off last week. So we have these wars between the Sasanians and the Romans. In particular, we have King Kavad I, King of Kings of the Persian Empire, and he has just put down a major revolt in his country. He asks for financial assistance from the Byzantines, and the Byzantines refuse to provide it. So he uses this as a pretext to launch a war against the Byzantines in order to take some of the lands that are on the border. And as you can see from the picture, the border region between the Sasanian Empire and the Roman Empire is Armenia. So you have Persian Armenia on the eastern side, you have Roman Armenia or Byzantine Armenia on the western side. And so Chief Minister Shukra of King Kavad I launches a war. He attacks the city of Theodosiopolis. He attacks the city of Edessa. And he raises siege to the city of Amida. All of these cities being cities with a large Armenian, if not majority Armenian population. These wars end up being called the Anastasian Wars because it was Emperor Anastasius I of the Byzantine Empire who was in power when this war began. And it was a very difficult war with large-scale massacres by both Persians and Romans in this territory, trying to deplete the other of useful resources. Accordingly, many Armenian civilians died along with other local civilians. We then see an increasing presence of Armenians in the Byzantine government. So, and in the Byzantine army. So we even have entire divisions of the Byzantine army made up of Armenians. And so they have distinctive dress and military gear. You can see there with the rounded shield and the pole arm. We also see the introduction of Armenians into the actual leadership of the empire. The first half Armenian emperor was Emperor Heraclius, who ruled from 610 to 641. What was the allure of what? So we have Armenians who were involved in the Roman Empire, like, as I said, Emperor Heraclius. We also had before him Emperor Maurice, who had expanded the bureaucracy and included many Armenians in government. Armenians were particularly seen as useful in terms of record keeping, and they began to migrate further west from what was originally the Armenian homeland to settle in areas closer to Constantinople in order to be of use to the Byzantine government. I have a question about what was the benefit of them going and supporting the Byzantines. The advantage is simple. The Byzantines as the runners of a multi-ethnic, multinational empire were interested in incorporating the best and brightest talent in terms of their governmental administration. And the Armenians were relatively literate, relatively well accomplished financially. And so it made sense to incorporate them like it would any other minority. And the Armenians saw a strong affinity to the Byzantine Empire as long as they had permission to practice their religion, which came and went depending on the emperor. We also have Armenian participation in the Byzantine Sasanian Wars. In fact, Vardan III Mamikonian, different from the Vardan Mamikonian in the Battle of Avarear, Vardan III was one of the key causes for the Second Byzantine Sasanian War. He managed to antagonize the Sasanian government. He was in Persian Armenia, and he made an alliance with the Byzantines in order to protect him. Now, we talked about the Third Byzantine Sasanian War when we discussed in the second in this series the foundations that allowed Islam to prevail. But you can see one of the things that we didn't really talk about in that discussion was how Armenia really sits right at the border of the Byzantine and Sassanid empires. And one of the things to note, and you can see it sort of on this map, if you look very closely, almost all the areas of the Middle East were conquered by the Persians at some point during the Third Byzantine Sasanian War. You can see Egypt is crosshatched, all the Levant region is crosshatched, the eastern part of Anatolia is crosshatched, and including all of Armenia. So Armenia became the site of a lot of the conflict. And in particular, in the year 622, when Emperor Heraclius of the Byzantine Empire is launching his counteroffensive against the Persians who had taken so much land in the early part of the war, that counteroffensive went right through the Armenian heartland. He went through north of Van, then over the Aras River, and attacked Persian positions from the north. As part of his counteroffensive against the Sasanians, he burnt the city of Divin, right? We've been mentioning the city of Divin, this capital city of the Marspanate, and one of the centers of Armenian cultural life, and he destroyed it on his way to defeating the Persians. At this same point, the Persians and the Byzantines had exhausted themselves completely on account of this war, which really gave the Islamic Empire that was starting to form in the Middle East, and that we discussed a little bit more in the third entry into this series, to take advantage of this and to start expanding north. Where it really matters for Armenia is that you begin this period starting in 630, 632, where the Islamic Emirate that you can see here, this sort of green area, this Islamic Emirate starts expanding outward. And in 634, they had already sent emissaries to Armenia and met with the Nakharars that were there. In fact, in 634, they had begun to speak with Theodoros Rushtuni. And Theodoros Rushtuni was one of these Nakharars, one of these Armenian nobles. And they convinced him to join up with them in terms of leaving the Byzantine Empire, which now had dominion over the western part of Armenia, and to become a servant of the Muslim state. He would be guaranteed a certain amount of autonomy in the territory of Armenia if he would do this. Now, there were repeated times that the Byzantines would come in and reconquer, and Theodoros Rushtuni would declare allegiance to the Byzantines, and then the Arabs would come, and he would declare allegiance to the Arabs. But by 656, he had declared allegiance to each side too many times, and the Arabs executed him and incorporated Armenia under a different set of Nakharars, based in also Dvin. They decided to model the Persian system of creating a governor who would sit in Dvin, and we'll talk a little bit more about this system. And that governor would meet with the Nakharars, and the Nakharars would therefore continue to do local administration. From the Arabo-Muslim perspective, it was critical to control the Caucasus region and expand further north. So they had focused a lot more of their efforts in the fortress of Derbent. You can see that up there, which they conquered in 651. They called it the Bab al-Abwab, the door of doors, meaning that it was the entryway to the Caucasus region. At that moment, the Caucasus region was controlled by the Khazars. And in many cases, Armenian help in repelling the Khazars was more important to the Arabs than any kind of large-scale subjugation. That said, you do have cases where, for example, King Adornase II of Iberia being one of the Georgian kingdoms, King Adornase II rebelled against Arab suzerainty, and the Arabs were forced to fight wars up in this Caucasus region. But generally speaking, they had a positive view of their Armenian subjects. At the same time, we have other states in the Caucasus. One in particular is Caucasian Albania. And Caucasian Albania, you can see on the map on the right-hand side, which is a little bit later in time, but should sort of lay things out. Caucasian Albania is in the western part of the modern country of Azerbaijan, and the Caucasian Albanians were like the Armenian Church, expelled during the Council of Chalcedon for exactly the same reason. They didn't believe in the Diophysitic Christ, and from about 500 to about 700 CE, they were an independent Oriental Orthodox Church. But even at that point, there's a lot of consultation between the Caucasian Albanian Church and the Armenian Apostolic Church. By about the 700s, there weren't enough Christians in Caucasian Albania to justify an independent church, and so the Caucasian Albanian Church was folded into the Armenian Apostolic Church. Many of the kings of Caucasian Albania at this time were pious Christians. You can see King Javanshir, who ruled roughly the same time as Theodoros Rushtuni, and is the last king of Albania, the last independent king of Albania, before Albania submitted to Arab rule. And the dynasty would continue for another 2 centuries as Arab suzerains. Now, this is where we start moving from history to current politics, and so I'm going to couch it in that. The Azerbaijani government has made the claim that the Caucasian Albanian Church has always been a unique and independent church, and has supported the Udi minority, which is about 1,000 people in the Republic of Azerbaijan, as being a distinct religious group under the Caucasian Albanian Church. And you can see the Udis have only a few churches left in Azerbaijan because of their small numbers. And this one in the center is one of those Udi churches. And I chose that as a representation of the Caucasian Albanian Church to the extent that it can be. The general view outside of Azerbaijan is that the Caucasian Albanian Church is part of the Armenian Apostolic Church and has no meaningful distinctions from the Armenian Apostolic Church in terms of its views or organization, since it is one of the subordinate parts of it. So make of that what you will.
Rich, I have a question.
Sure.
Hi. So the question is the following. Now, we know that, there was a big confrontation between Byzantium and Arab states, and between them was Khazars. Was there anything like that to do with also Armenians to be?
I actually have a slide on that. So, all right. So we move into more centralized Arab rule under the Umayyads, right? The Rashidun Caliphate was the first Arab government, and that government survived from about 632 until 661, when you had that Islamic civil war that we talked about in the fourth entry in this series. And during the Arab rule, Armenia was out of sight, out of mind for the majority of that period. The Umayyads were generally ignorant of the region and disinterested in the region. However, there were Khazar raiders that came from the north of the Caucasus. And in addition to threatening Derbent, they threatened a number of Arab holdings in the north of the Middle East. So Caliph Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan reached out to the Armenians and created a functional alliance with 6 of the major Nakharar families. You can see them there: Mamikonian, the Bagratunis, the Gnunis, Rushtunis, Kamsarakans, and Artsrunis. And by bringing these Nakharar families together, he was able to repel a number of threats like the Khazars that happened in 720, 730 under his successors. But over the course of Arab rule, several of these families fell in and out of favor with the Arabs. The Bagratunis and Artsrunis really became seen as more loyal to the Arabs than the other 4 families, and so the Arabs began to elevate them more and more within the territory. Now, of course, as the rules governing the Islamic Empire became more solidified, Armenians had to pay the jizya tax, which was a tax that all non-Muslims had to pay for the right to practice non-Islamic religion. But as long as they paid that tax, they were able to keep their holdings or their land. But there were occasions where the jizya tax was incredibly onerous, and we have documentation of Armenians petitioning both Damascus and Baghdad for a reprieve from these jizya taxes. And on account of this, we do have rebellions from almost all of these Nakharar families, but they never revolt as a unified force, and they never revolt in the name of Armenia. They only revolt to the extent that they are trying to limit their own either financial outlay or production outlay to the Arab empires, be it the Umayyads or the Abbasid Caliphate. Now, when we talk about the structure of Arab rule in the region, the Arabs will introduce a wali, or a governor, and this wali eventually becomes called the Ostikan or Iskhan. Both of these names are quite common, and this governor position survives more or less unchanged for the next 1,000 years, even though Armenia goes through a number of different administrations through those from different empires throughout those 1,000 years. This rule, this Ostikan or Iskhan, survives as a governor. Below the Iskhan, below the Ostikan is the Iskhan, this prince, and the prince is the one who has direct responsibility to the Ostikan, to the wali, and the prince will be an Armenian. The Wali Ostikan will be somebody appointed by the occupying power. In this case, it's the Arabs. In later cases, it will be Persians or Turks or whoever. And below the Iskan were the Nakharar, these Armenian noble families, right? So this was how power was distributed in Armenia, which was a lot less centralized and a lot less directly controlled than we've seen in other Abbasid and Umayyad provinces that were directly controlled by the Wali and a number of other Arab government officials. So you can see that Armenians have much more freedom, politically speaking, within the Arab state than many of the other peoples that we've talked about before, such as the Persians or the Levantines or the Egyptians. Then around the year 880, as we've been talking, Armenia has been getting more and more power. These princes have becoming more and more independent of the Wali. And so in the year 880, Ashot I, sorry, I have a question. Was there a lingua franca? You're talking about a lot of people entering and leaving. Were there enough Latin speakers, perhaps Arabic? I'm speaking rather quickly, but the thing is that we're talking about hundreds of years. Most people in the region were multilingual. Persian was a very common lingua franca in this region. Arabic was a very common lingua franca in this region when the Arabs had rule over the area. Latin was not used. It would have been Greek. There were other church languages like Syriac that people spoke. The Caucasus was always a difficult place to communicate in, but a lot of people spoke multiple languages in this region. So communication was not a terrible difficulty. But back to the story, right? So you have this prince from the Bagratunis, and he is able to control a lot of internal policy, and he's threading a really nice balance between the Byzantine Empire in the west and the Arabs in the south. And as the Arab power is weakening and the Byzantine power is rising, Prince Ashot reaches out to both of them, and both of them, in order to try and create a vassal state, as opposed to trying to conquer the region, which they know would be difficult. Both the Byzantine ambassador, Byzantine ambassador represented by Emperor Basil I, and representatives of the Abbasid Caliphate rush to give Ashot a crown so that he can make himself king. And so this becomes the first kingdom of Armenia in the last 400 years, which is the Bagratid kingdom run by the Bagratuni family. And so King Ashot is able to consolidate his power from 884 to 890, and he manages to take a number of different regions. You can see on the map here, which shows his early power period. He took areas in what is today Armenia and Turkey and small parts of Iran and Azerbaijan. Because of the location of his state directly between the Byzantine Empire and the Abbasid Caliphate, King Ashot I had to really balance the interests of these two states, although he continued to lean slightly more towards the Byzantines. And so we sort of enter a point we've talked about before of the Iranian intermezzo. And so what happened here was that the Abbasid Caliphate became weak enough that a number of Turkish and Persian, mostly Persian leaders began to split off from the Abbasid Caliphate's terrestrial control and create their own states, right? So you've got a number of them on this map. You have the Buyid Emirates, you have the Safavids, you have the Safarids. But what matters to us actually are two dynasties that started in the Caucasus region. There were the Sajids and the Salarids. The Sajids were the earlier of the two. And as you can see from the map, the Sajids extended all the way to Lake Van on their western side and controlled the area around Lake Sevan, which is the main lake in the modern post-Soviet Armenia. This meant that the Sajids became a direct threat to the Bagratid state. Because if you look at the Bagratid state, it controlled area around Lake Van and just to the north of Lake Sevan. So the Sajids became representative of this Ostikhan system, and the Abbasids would use the Sajids to have territorial power over the Armenian state, even if the Armenian state was nominally independent. And you can see, even if you look closely at this Armenian intermezzo map, even by the time of the Salarids, which was in 970, the city of Divin sticks out as this small promontory that the Salarids are able to control, because they had their governor still in Divin, still exacting tribute from the independent state of Armenia, the Bagratid Empire. So we also have a lot of high power politics with the Armenians from the other powerful states in the region. So you have Yusuf ibn Abil Saj, and this, as you can tell from his last name, Abil Saj, he was one of the Sajid rulers. And Yusuf wanted to have more leverage and power over the Bagratid kingdom. And so he supported one of the Artsruni nobles, right? We've talked about how there are different Nakharars and they come from different families. Well, the Artsrunis wanted to create their own kingdom. And so Yusuf ibn Abi al-Saj gave power to one of the Artsrunis named Gagik and crowned him as King Gagik of Vaspurakan, which is to the southern, just to the south of the Bagratid Armenian state. And that became independent in 908. So about 25 to 30 years after King Ashot I makes Greater Armenia independent, you now have the Second Armenian Kingdom, right? And this divide between Armenian states allows the Sajids to have a lot more leverage over the politics and control of Armenia. During this period, we also have the crystallization, or the beginning of the crystallization, of Armenian history. And we've already talked about Moses Khorenatsi. Moses Khorenatsi was in the 5th century, but now we have another historian. In the West, he's known as John V, the historian. In Armenian, he's Ovanes Draskanakartsi, and you can see him there. And when Draskanakartsi moved to Vaspurakan, he gave a sense of legitimacy to this second Armenian state, resulting in an increased power dynamic between the Bagratid Armenian state, which tended to be a little bit more pro-Byzantine, and the Vaspurakan Armenian state, which tended to be a little bit more pro-Abbasid. This got to the point where when King Ashot II was supposed to take power in 914, there was actually a pretender that was appointed by the Sajids in Dvin, and this is King Ashot II of Bagratid Armenia, right? Not Vaspurakan, Bagratid Armenia. But the Sajids still had some power there. And so they appointed their own King Ashot, the Sparparet. The Sparparet. I wish there were more different names, but unfortunately, so King Ashot the Sparparet was seen as a pretender, and King Ashot II, Yerkat meaning iron, had to go to Constantinople to get a Byzantine army to support him in overthrowing King Ashot and creating a more functional Bagratid state that was increasingly even more independent of the Sajids. And he was able to do this in 916. The way he did this was through getting the Byzantine Empire to create a domestic of schools. Now, a domestic of schools was a military rank in the Byzantine Empire, and that military rank would bring with him a small army, and through that army, he was able. King Ashot II was able to conquer the territory of Armenia back from Ashot the Sparparet. After he had done this in 916, he had another 13 years of rule in which the Arab states, led by their proxies, right, like the Sajids, and later the Salarids, and even the Byzantines tried to invade and remove him from power. King Ashot II was an incredible military mastermind and was able to defeat each of these attempts and at the same time expand his power base. such that by the time that he was done ruling, the area that he controlled was on both sides of Lake Sevan and extended all the way down to Lake Van, limiting the territory of Vaspurakan in order to consolidate Armenian power. He was succeeded by his brother Abbas I, and Abbas I surprisingly had very few battles in his reign, but was able to preside over nearly 20 years of prosperity and growth. We see from this period a large amount of Armenian art produced, and we see a large amount of written documentation from the period of Abbas I. But Abbas I really heralds the beginning of the highest point of the Bagratid kingdom of Armenia, which is led by King Ashot III. And Ashot III manages to expand Armenia to its greatest length and incorporates the kingdom of Vaspurakan. So Ashot III has a very interesting idea, which will seem very familiar to us who have seen the Turks, but this is before the Turks have implemented this idea. And his idea is that he will divide the larger Bagratid kingdom of Armenia into a number of smaller kingdoms and give those kingdoms to the Nakharars, so that way they can rule over small territories. And at the same time, he would acknowledge himself and be acknowledged by these kings as the primus inter pares, the king of kings, and therefore be able to control all of Armenia. And as long as you had a strong ruler in the center of Armenia, this would work. And so King Ashot III managed to preside over an incredibly powerful Armenian empire. At this same time, in the year 961, he develops what is known as the city of 1001 churches, the city of Ani, which sits now on the Turkish side of the Turkish-Armenian border. And that city became the capital of Armenia. It was seen as a very majestic and beautiful city, and was one of the dominant cities in terms of trade and culture in the Middle Ages, especially in this part of the world. People came from all over to trade in the city of Ani. And you can see from the stylized picture here a number of different Armenian churches and the Bagratid lion, which was the sort of symbol of the empire. You also have in this period an expansion of the art and other cultural developments that had come during the Abbas I period. It was at this point that Armenia was able to even demand tribute from some of the smaller neighboring states, especially like Aran or the Georgian Bagratids. So this is a little bit more in depth of Ani. You can see in the center sort of an idealized vision of what that city looked like. It had a large surrounding wall, and you can see the Aras River flowing through the city. The city is on the west bank of the river, and you can see in the picture on the lower right-hand side some of the ruins of the city, and you can see the Aras River is still there. If you're looking on the near side of the picture where the church is, that is sovereign Turkish territory today. And if you're looking on the far side of the river, that is sovereign Armenian territory today. So you can see how close it is to the current Armenian border. And some of the churches, their frescoes have survived to a certain degree. You can see the pictures on the left-hand side, and in some cases they have not survived. But it's a ruin that you can visit to this day. But at this time, it was really an incredible power center in Armenia. So now we have to sort of realize what's going on with the Byzantine Empire towards this kingdom of Armenia. And we saw in some of the previous slides, Emperor John I Symmachus. He's the first one, but he's one of these emperors, but there are others as well, such as his predecessor, such as his successor, Emperor Basil II, who ruled for nearly 50 years. And these emperors are not content with the current borders in the Eastern Front that they have. And so they begin an expansionary war against the Armenians. taking their territories. And you can see from the map on the right hand side, that the area of Armenia includes a lot of areas that became part of the Byzantine Empire by the year 1025. And the Byzantines, by expanding their border, now had territory on Lake Von. And even Ani was just outside of their grasp. They would get it in 1045. When they did this, though, they would fight against the individual kings that King Ashot III had created, right? Because Armenia was now all these different little principalities. He was able to fight against one of these principalities or another principality, and take territories piece by piece. In some cases, the way that Basil II or Tsimikes did it before him was to offer the Armenian Nakharars adequate compensation. So one of the kings, for example, one of the princes was Senekirim Hovanes Artsruni, and he was offered to leave his territory in exchange for living in the city of Sebastia, modern-day Sivas in Turkey, which is further west. And you can see this is his throne from the 1800s, when Armenians still existed in large numbers in that part of Turkey. So this was the case for a number of Armenian rulers who, after either being defeated or in lieu of a fight, were given territories inside the Byzantine Empire to financially compensate them as their people came under the Byzantine authority. We also see during this point that the Armenians are facing threats from the south, and those threats are in the form of new Turkic invaders. We've seen these Turkic invaders in the Islamic history series. We remember that Turks, especially Mamluks, were part of the Abbasid Empire starting as early as the Anarchy of Samarra in the 860s. But by now, we have Turks that are instantiated in the the eastern part of the Abbasid Caliphate. We had the Battle of Dandan Khan, fought in 1040 by the Seljuks, but there were already Turkic groups that were in here. And the Turks posed a direct threat to the survival of the Armenian states. And in many cases, an alliance with the Byzantines was more helpful to a lot of these rulers than trying to oppose the Turks on their own. So after the Byzantines had taken the majority of Bagratid territory, they went after the city of Ani, fighting a war for it in 1042 to 1045. Now, the first war that the Byzantines launched against Ani was a resounding Armenian defensive success. Sparapet, Vahram Pahlevuni, the Pahlevuni are another one of these Nakharar families, and Vahram Pahlevuni was the chief military advisor, the Sparapet of the Bagratid state. He was able to fight the Byzantine forces outside of the wall, engage them closely, and defeat them outside of the walls. And so, convinced that he could not breach the walls of Ani through military force, Emperor Constantine IX decided to deceive King Gagik II of Bagratid Armenia. What he did was he called the king to Constantinople to negotiate a long-term truce. And when he did this, he basically imprisoned him and forced him to sign over the kingdom. Previously, right, the kings of Ani had met with the Byzantines and had fruitful relations. You can see King Ovanes Simbat III in this Byzantine manuscript shaking hands with the emperor, but that completely changed when the Byzantines decided to annex the city by taking advantage of their king. So one of the things that we sort of end this period with is that a number of these Bagratid states had slowly become absorbed by the Byzantine Empire, but there was one of these Bagratid principalities that persisted, and that was the Principality of Artsakh. So Artsakh at that time was composed of several different territories, but in terms of modern parlance, the biggest territories that it composed were Syunik or Zangezur region and the mountainous Karabakh region. And so those regions became those became the Principality of Artsakh, and after the Bagratid kingdom fell, it was the last real Armenian state in the region. We don't actually know much of the history about what happened in that area. It alternates between the names Artsakh and Khachen, but we really don't hear much until the rule of Hassan Jalal. And so when he comes up, I'll get to that history. So between 950 and 1045, we have large waves of Armenian migrations in the Byzantine Empire, further west than the Armenian homeland. And they sort of migrate in sort of three different categories of people. The first one, as we sort of pointed out, are those who migrated to Constantinople. And they migrated to Constantinople because that was the center of business, development, economic growth within the Byzantine Empire. And the Byzantine Empire was growing immensely. During the reign of Tsimikes and Basil II, the empire more than doubled in size, and so there was lots of space for the Armenians to now become part of that empire. To that point, you have the lower arrow, which points towards the Mediterranean Sea, and a lot of Armenians were deported from their lands between the year 900 and 1050 to populate these areas that the Byzantine Empire had recovered from the Arab states. As we moved into the late 900s and early thousands, the Byzantines were making incredible strides against the Arab states, which, as we pointed out, had been in the intermezzo period, which was when the Abbasids were losing their power to the Persians in the east, and accordingly, their areas in what's now Syria, southeastern Turkey, these areas were now up for grabs in a way that they had never been before. So the Byzantine rise and the Arab fall meant that numerous cities came under Byzantine control, and they deported populations from all over the empire in order to fill these cities with people. Armenians were no exception to this. In fact, they were disproportionately represented among the populations that were deported to these regions. And then, of course, the middle arrow shows what we had discussed before, where several of the Nakharars of that had formed these various principalities in Armenia were resettled further west in the empire, and therefore away from the border regions where the Byzantines could resettle peoples that they considered to be more loyal to them and less problematic if the Turks should invade. You can see in the upper right-hand side one of the Byzantine invasions. The Byzantines launched a war against Aleppo. They were not able to take Aleppo in 962. They didn't hold it for long, but they did hold a lot of areas along the Mediterranean coast. And you can see Antiochia, you can see Adana. These areas came under Byzantine control and were increasingly populated by Armenian minorities. We also begin to see, and this was something that we sort of picked up on, but we didn't really address in large scale, we begin to see Armenians outside of historic Armenia in a much broader sense, right? We saw the Armenian migrations in the Byzantine Empire to areas that were not historically Armenian, but Egypt is far, far away from the areas where we expect Armenian settlement. And what ends up happening here is that towards the end of the Bagratid Armenian phase, there begins to be a tribute of Armenians to the Arab states. And this is very similar to what would eventually become the Devshirme system in the Ottoman Empire, or the Kurdish system in the Safavid Empire, where Armenians are deported and brought into a Muslim-run state because they have no allegiance to anybody in that state, and they are slaves, soldiers, Mamluks. And so we see these Mamluks developing in Egypt during the Fatimid period. And increasingly, the Armenian Mamluks in the Fatimid period acquire more and more power. So the first Armenian that we know, the first Armenian Mamluk that we know that actually came to power directly in Fatimid Egypt was Badr al-Jamali, and he ruled from 1063 till 1094. Sorry, 1063 to 1073. And we don't know much about his childhood, but we know that he was an Armenian slave that was taken to Egypt, raised by the Fatimid Caliph, and then made Grand Vizier of the country. In his role as Grand Vizier, he effectively had more control than the Caliph had, the Fatimid Caliph had, and his son Al-Afdal, Al-Afdal Shahanshah, who was now half Armenian, continued to rule the Fatimid state. So you had both of these men, however, Badr al-Jamali and Al-Afdal Shahanshah, were Muslim. Badr al-Jamali, when he became a Mamluk, was forcibly converted. And as a sign of his Islamic faith, he was responsible for the construction of Al-Juyushi Mosque, which you can see there. It still survives in Egypt to this day. One interesting thing of note is that Al-Afdal Shahanshah is indirectly responsible for creating an entire sect of Islam. The Fatimids who ruled in Egypt had a succession issue between two sons, and Al-Afdal Shahanshah chose the younger son because he believed he could manipulate that son. The older son, Nizar, struck out and tried to take control. Al-Afdal Shahanshah put him down, which resulted in him fleeing to Iran and creating the Nizari Ismailis, the order that created the assassins. We've discussed them in previous conversations. But it's sort of an interesting thing to imagine that an Armenian was responsible for the creation of Nizari Ismaili Shiism indirectly by choosing a different successor than the one that the other Ismailis would have chosen for themselves. So now we have the entry of probably the most famous interloper in Armenian history. We have the Turks really arriving into Anatolia. They've previously come from Central Asia. This is an Oghuz Turkish tribe, and their progenitor is Seljuk Bey. But by the time that they get to Eastern Anatolia, it's taken up by his two sons, Tughril and Shaghreb Bey. And Tughril is the one who leads the majority of the invasion. And we have Armenian resistance to these Turkish invasions. So it's not just the Battle of Manzikert in 1071. The Turks had come in waves trying to attack the areas of Armenia. We have a battle in 1054 where Tughril is fighting against the Sparapet Tatul Vanadetsi, and he takes Vanadetsi captive. This is an apocryphal story in 1054 that Tughril says to Vanadetsi, I will release you if my prisoner comes back. And Vanadetsi says, don't bother. If he was run through with my spear, he'll never recover. And that's what happened. The other captive died, and so Vanadetsi was executed. You also have Alparslan, who's the son of Tughril, leading the sack of Ani in 1064. And his troops marched through the porous Byzantine borders and sacked Ani, which had been now in Byzantine control for 19 years, which is why the city is a ruin today. Armenians from Ani fled westward further into the Byzantine Empire in advance of the Turkish armies. Now, the Battle of Manzikert was a hugely pivotal battle, but the reason for the Turkic success in this battle has to do a lot more with Byzantine internal politics than it does with unique strategies of the Turks. Now, of course, the Turks had practiced what they called the feint retreat, which is where they used their light cavalry and they would retreat first and create distance between the frontline troops and the command structure further back. Then once the frontline troops were isolated enough, they would turn around and attack those frontline troops. And this was very successful, leading to the ability for the Seljuks to crush both the right side, crush the right side flank, then encircle the center, which included the emperor himself. You can see where I've circled it in the picture. That's where the where Emperor Romanos IV, the Byzantine Empire, was situated. And the rear guard, led by Andronikos Doukas, actually retreated because he had a personal conflict with the Emperor Romanos. When Alparslan had defeated the Varangian guard that was surrounding Emperor Romanos, he actually captured the emperor and ransomed him back to the Byzantine Empire. There's a famous line that the Turks recall, which is that when Alparslan got Emperor Romanos, he said, "Emperor, what would you do if you were in my place?" And he said, "I would kill you." And Alparslan said, I'll do you one worse. I'll let you live." Right? Because of course he would live with the humiliation that he'd been so defeated by the Turks. So when the Turks moved into Anatolia, and you can see how quickly they did this, right? Between the maps of 1072 on the left-hand side and 1075 on the right-hand side, almost all of Anatolia comes under Turkic control. And certainly all of Armenia is under Turkic control. They did this by creating the Ekta system, which apportioned land into different small states, similar to what we had talked about with Armenia. And this Ekta system resulted in Turkic warlords establishing themselves as leaders of small principalities, swearing loyalty to the Great Seljuk, who would be the leader of all Turks. So I just wanted to sort of, as a reprise, go back over both as a reprise and looking forward, what Armenia looks like. So if we look at 970 CE, we still have a kingdom of Armenia. We have the kingdom of Vaspurakan. We have a number of different Armenian states that are sort of in confederation there. By 1094, right after the battle of, about 10 years after the Battle of Manzikert, we have no Armenian states anymore. By 1157, we're going to start to have a new Armenian state. Right here, it's classified as a crusader state, which is not an unfair characterization. It's and in the last one, you have 1175, where you can see the area of Taurus is controlled by the Byzantine Empire, because the Armenian state of Cilicia had been repressed at that time. And to take a closer view, you can sort of see that all of historic Armenia was under different types of Seljuk control, all of these microstates run by different Turkic leaders, all swearing loyalty to the Great Seljuk. And you can see by those orange lines are the edges of Seljuk control. All of the areas of Armenia are under Seljuk control. This is sort of what we talked about a little bit when it came to the sects of Christianity. You can see the Great Schism, how all the different churches separated. If you follow the purple is the Oriental Orthodox, which is among which are counted the Armenians. And so they split off from the early church in 451, and the Chalcedonian church continues from that break, leading to the Eastern Orthodox and Catholic churches. And the Catholic Church, of course, splits in at the Reformation into the Protestant churches, just so we have sort of a headspace about how all these churches split. But one of the interesting things you can see here are these dotted lines. If you look closely at the yellow and purple lines, you can see that they have a dotted line, and it connects back to some of the red lines where it says the Eastern Rites. Now, this is sort of an interesting thing, which is that the Catholic Church will accept if a church that has rejected Catholic teaching creates a rapprochement, they will accept them as part of the Catholic Church. And that has happened for the Nestorian Church, right, which has created the Chaldean Catholic Church. There's an Armenian Catholic Church on the same grounds today. There are Byzantine Catholics on the same grounds today. There were these unions of church synods with the Catholic Church, and that resulted of these resulted in these groups being recognized as Catholics. The question on percentage of Armenians in Cilicia, we'll get to that. All right. So during this point in 1054, right, we sort of breezed by it, right, when we went to the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, but we have this great schism in 1054 between the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. Now, the Eastern Orthodox Church had never been terribly accommodating of Armenian religion. Armenians were generally either taxed or prevented from building new churches if they were outside of Bagratid Armenia. But the split between East and West meant that there was now a new Christian center that the Armenians could appeal to. It wasn't just Constantinople, and the Pope would have his own agency in relations with Armenia. So as we mentioned, Armenians had migrated through the empire, and so you get to this point in the late 1000s where either a significant minority or the majority of the population surrounding the Mediterranean Sea in this in the province that's labeled there as Adana, number 33, those are Armenians in that province. So you begin to have different leaders within the Byzantine Empire beginning to fight for their own independence in that region. So one particular example is Philaretos Brachamios, who's known in Armenian as Bahram Barajnoni. And Philaretos Brachamios was one of these deacons, one of these Byzantine military leaders, and he manages to create his own dukedom that controls some of the area around Antioch, up the coast, and around the Euphrates River. You can see it on the map below. Philaretos Brachamios was not known as the most accommodating and lovely individual, and he attracted antagonism from both Sultan Malik Shah of the Seljuks and from other Turks based in Syria that ended up overthrowing his country in 1085. The Byzantines also fought against him when he refused to recognize their sovereignty. You also have the beginnings of Armenians beginning to work for the independence of a state after Philaretos in the south part of Turkey, where it's labeled here Armenian Cilicia. Of course, this is Armenian Cilicia at its largest borders, but you can see that these states are much further west of Bagratid Armenia and historic Armenia. But because of the migrations of the Armenian people, there were significant populations of Armenians here. Some may even say the majority of the population in this region, because this region had been resettled when the Byzantines conquered it. So a couple things that I want to point out when it comes to geography. If we look at the southern part of Anatolia, we have this Taurus mountain range that cuts across that area and creates a real barrier to entry if you're coming from the north. The one exception is where I've circled just north of the S, which is called the Gates of Cilicia, which is a mountain pass that you can use to enter the territory. Once you get to the southeast of the Gates of Cilicia, you have a plains region, which is really great for growing wheat and other kinds of crops. And so you can sustain a large population in this area south of the mountains. The other circle there I put because we're going to see the sea fort of Korikos, and that sea fort is within that circle area. So, right, you have these massive Taurus mountains, and you have the Cilician Gates, which was really the only entryway, making this area incredibly defensible. You have castles built all throughout the mountains by Armenians. You can see this is a castle near the former Armenian city of Sis, which is known today as Karaman. No, sorry. No, sorry. It's known as it's known as Marash, Kahran Marash. And you can see the Armenian Calithic. Wow, I can't pronounce anything today. Cilician Armenian Catholicostate. That was where the Armenian Catholicos, the head of the Armenian religion, operating in Cilicia, was based. And this was a picture from 1914. Of course, after that year, the Armenian Catholicostate no longer existed for reasons connected to the genocide. You can also see the sea castle of Korikos. Originally, this was a Byzantine structure, but as the Armenians expanded their power in Cilicia, they took over this fortress and it became one of their most famous fortresses. It takes up almost the entirety of this 3-kilometer square island. And yeah, it still remains to this day. So when we talk about Cilician Armenia, we're first talking about a dukedom within the Byzantine Empire. Reuben I, Lord of Cilicia, declares himself prince, but he asserts independence, but he still pays tribute to the Byzantine Empire, right? And you can see that there's a border between the Byzantines and his state. His state is just the red area, but the Byzantines controlled the coast and sort of those orangish areas. Eventually, the state would expand to the coast, but because it was situated in the mountains, Reuben I was able to consolidate power and build several castles, in addition to the ones he took, like Barzabed Castle. Yeah, and so he was able to create for the first time this principality of Cilicia. Now, at the same time that Reuben is operating, about 10-15 years later, we have the beginnings of the Crusades, right? We have Pope Urban II at the Council of Clermont. We have leading a crusade. We first have the People's Crusade, which is an abysmal failure. But then we have the Crusade, the Knights' Crusades, the Princes' Crusades, which start in Constantinople and have 2 major victories at Nicaea and Dorylaeum in 1097. And then after that, they managed to make their way to Cilician Armenia. You can see the map on the right-hand side where they enter Cilician Armenia, and they are replenished by the Armenians who live there. The Prince of Armenia reaches out to the Pope and signals his willingness to have an alliance with the Catholic Church against the Muslims. And this Armeno-Crusader relations gets taken to another level when one of the leading knights in the crusade, which is Baldwin, comes to the city of Edessa, which is a city with a majority Armenian population. Edessa is the city of Urfa in Turkey today. And this city, as I said, has a majority Armenian population, but because it was integrated into the Byzantine Empire, its ruler is an Eastern Orthodox Armenian, meaning that he believes in the Byzantine Eastern Orthodox Church, but he's ethnically Armenian, which makes him deeply unpopular. And this is Toros of Edessa. So when Baldwin comes in, the fact that he is Catholic means that he is supported by the Armenians in overthrowing this Byzantine appointed leader, Toros. And Baldwin is given the keys to the city by the Armenian clergy in 1098. And he declares himself Baldwin, the Count of Edessa. And the county of Edessa survives from 1098 until 1144. It's the first Crusader state to form and the first Crusader state to be lost. But what's important to point out here is that just like most Crusader states, but especially this is the case for Edessa, the majority of the population was not Crusader. The majority of the population was local peoples. And so the Catholic alliance with the Armenians was absolutely critical to maintaining control over the county of Edessa, because the Armenians were the largest single group in the region. And so by the end of the First Crusade, the Crusaders had established 4 distinct states, right? They established Edessa, Antioch, Tripoli, and Jerusalem. And the Armenians were part and parcel of all of these states. That said, the way that they had struck the deal in Edessa was not the way that they were able to strike a deal in any of the other Crusader states. And so in each of these Crusader states, Armenians were seen as less than Latin Christians, despite them being seen as more than non-Christians. We have negotiations between the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the Principality of Armenia concerning how Armenians should be viewed in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, especially because Armenian Cilicia wanted to send a delegation to Jerusalem for religious reasons. And the Kingdom of Jerusalem explained that they would have to pay a dime, or a small tax, because they were not Latin Christians. At the same time, as Cilicia was getting more and more freedom, the Byzantines were unhappy with the way that their dukedom was increasingly showing signs of independence. So Emperor John II Komnenos began an expansionist war where he conquered Armenia, Cilician Armenia, and he did this by taking Prince Leo I and putting him in chains. When I say that, I mean that John II Komnenos had invited Leo I to discuss policy with him in Constantinople, and in so doing, he imprisoned Leo I. As just like with King Gagik, we have this act where the Byzantine emperor deceives the ruler of an Armenian region and then proceeds to take their territory. And so by 1142, John II Komnenos had controlled all of Cilician Armenia and was trying to extend his power further south into territory that was either allied with the Crusader states or part of the Crusader states or part of the enemies of the Crusader states. So you have, for example, John II launching the siege of Shaizar in 1138. But while his Byzantine troops are very active in trying to take down the fortress, the troops from the county of Edessa, which were there, only participated nominally and did not seem very interested, the same with those from Antioch. Those two principalities had much better relations with the Armenians than they had with the Byzantines, because of the Armeno-Crusader relationship. We then deal with the story of Toros the Great. Toros the Great was living in exile. He had been imprisoned by the Byzantines with his father, Leo I, but he managed to take a boat that would sneak him into Syria. And once he got to Syria, he was able to get to the county of Edessa, and from there fight to take back Armenian Cilicia from the successor of John II Komnenos. And he managed to do this. And you would think, of course, now that he would be at risk of war from the Seljuks, but it turns out that the Seljuk leader at the time, Kilij Arslan II, was actually really enamored with Toros of Edessa, with Toros the Great, and so created an alliance with him. The two of them managed to avoid each other in conflict because the Seljuk sultans in Anatolia, this is now the Seljuk Sultanate of Rome, are no longer interested in the politics of the lower Middle East, right? The area of Syria and the area of the Levant is not their concern. So we then have Prince Toros aligning himself with the Crusader states of Antioch and Edessa, Antioch and Edessa, and performing numerous raids against Muslims in the region. You also have wars against the Byzantines in the region, such as the sack of Cyprus in 1156. But there becomes an incredible amount of coordination between three people: Toros, and the Crusaders Reynald de Chatillon, and Bohemond III of Antioch. All three of these people perform raids against Muslim states, especially as we get closer and closer to this time, the rule of Nur ad-Din Zengi, which we've talked about on the Crusader side, who was really the biggest threat to an independent, to the Crusader kingdoms, because it was a unified Muslim resistance in what's now Syria and Jordan. Also, it's worth noting that Edessa falls in 1146, which ends that part of the relationship. Edessa is conquered by Nur ad-Din Zengi. So, as we move towards Saladin taking power, we see that Saladin is able to conquer nearly all of the Crusader states. You can see a little bit left of Antioch, a little bit left of Tripoli, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem only controls the city-state of Tyre. The Armenians still continue to try and support the Crusader states, but it was looking increasingly grave for them. When the Third Crusaders came through, the Cilician Armenians supported them. These were the ones led by Barbarossa, Frederick II Barbarossa, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. And he gave them food as well as military training and sent an Armenian military delegation with them. Unfortunately, Frederick II Barbarossa had issues crossing the river between Armenian Cilicia and Antioch, and he died because he couldn't swim. The Holy Roman Emperor that succeeded him didn't honor his treaty with the Cilician Armenians, and this resulted in antagonism on the Armenian side. Now, we've seen this sort of push and pull between the Byzantines and Cilician Armenia, with Cilician Armenia not entirely declaring separation from the Byzantine Empire, but Levon II in 1198 decides to openly declare Cilician Armenia as an independent state. So one of the ways that he's able to do this is by getting a crown from the Pope. Now, one of the things in order to guarantee that you had an actual independent kingdom was that you had a crown given to you by a legal and respected Christian authority. And so relations with the Pope were critical in securing him that crown, because the relations with the Byzantine Empire, the Byzantines were never going to give him a crown. The separation between East and West allowed him to petition for that from the Pope. So, in so doing, he begins to try and reconcile with the Catholic Church. It doesn't end up working, it doesn't end up holding, but it works for long enough for King Lebon to be crowned the first king of Armenia. And he manages to inculcate strong alliances, not just with Antioch, but with the Knights Hospitalier and the Teutonic Order, in many cases gifting them territories along their shared border. He also leads a number of military campaigns through some of the Muslim allies in the region. One of these was Baghra's castle, which had been taken by Saladin. He managed to take the castle back. And he also managed to scare off a number of invasions from the from Saladin, from the Ayyubids, that would otherwise have compromised the region. But he knew that he did not have enough strength to directly attack the Ayyubids head on. The Ayyubids being the dynasty of Saladin. He knew that he didn't have the ability to attack them head on. The Crusaders were a little bit more headstrong, and this resulted in negative outcomes for the Crusaders and hurting their long-term viability. At the same time, King Levon opened up Cilicia because he had conquered the coastline. He was able to allow for an influx of merchants and traders. And so Venetians and Genoese, among others, began to settle in Armenian Cilicia and created their own quarters where they were able to conduct trade and live according to their own customs. This brought incredible wealth to Cilicia and made the region very prosperous. at the same time that the Byzantine Empire is waning, and Armenian Cilicia is growing, we also have the growth of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rome, which finally conquers Antalya, and which means that the Byzantine Empire and the Armenians no longer share a border, and this helps to secure Armenian independence. As you can see, the border of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rome follows the Caucasus the Taurus Mountains, meaning that Cilician Armenia remains independent. You can see in the upper right-hand side, Kizilkule, which is a Turkish fortress that was built in Alanya along this southern coast. Now, because of the relationships between the Armenians and the Crusaders, a number of the titles over the Kingdom of Armenia in Cilicia had passed to Crusaders. So we had, for example, John of Brienne, who is going to be detailed much more on the Crusader side, but it's just important to note that during the Fifth Crusade, there was a succession issue in Armenia, and since he was nominally the king of Armenia by this time, he had to abandon the Fifth Crusade to deal with problems in Armenia and then come back a year later. It's not the only reason the Fifth Crusade failed, but it's one of them. Now, we then begin to see Mongols entering Anatolia, and the first time that they do is in 1231. The Mongols who enter here are chasing Jalaluddin Makburni, who we've seen before. He was the leader of the Khwarezmian Empire in eastern Persia, and every time the Mongols had beaten him, he retreated west, and so he retreated west until he came to historic Armenia. And in historic Armenia, that is where Shorma Khan defeated him. Now, when the Mongols showed up in Anatolia, they, of course, as is typical, they committed a number of massacres. But the Armenians took the step of immediately sending messages to the Mongols that they submitted and that they would be vassals to the Mongols. And not only that, they would encourage others to do so as well. So in 1247, King Hetum I of Armenia sent emissaries to the Great Khan in order to create an alliance between the Armenians and the Mongols. The Georgians followed suit, like Armenian Cilicia. And in 1254, King Hetum I himself went to Karakorum and struck his own agreement that would allow for the Armenians to continue practicing their religion, to not be directly occupied by Mongol forces, as long as they brought Cilician knights to war on behalf of the Mongol sovereign. In the battle, and so the Armenians fought on the side of the Mongols in several other wars and campaigns that the Mongols fought in Anatolia, especially against the Turks. The most important one, of course, was the Battle of Kazidagh, or the Battle of Hairy Beard, where Armenians fought on the Mongol side. Interestingly enough, there were crusaders who fought on the Turkish side because they were paid mercenaries. And so you can see, even at the greatest extent of the Mongol Khanate in Anatolia, Cilicia remained at least nominally independent because of their suzerainty to the Mongols. Of course, because they were suzerains under the Mongols, they were required to field soldiers in the Mongol advances down the Levant region. And so when the Mongols besieged Aleppo in 1260, when they fought in Damascus, there were Armenian forces alongside the Mongols, and Antioch had also submitted as an ally of the Mongols as a vassal state, and so there were Antiochians as well, crusaders from Antioch. There are stories, we don't know how apocryphal they are, of 3 Christians, one being King Hetum I of Armenia, one being King Bohemond, I think it's the point, King Bohemond IV of Antioch, and Ketbuka of the Mongols, who was also Christian. These 3 Christians marching into the Great Mosque in Damascus, and proceeding to profane it. There are different but this story is most likely apocryphal. The Armenians were not involved, however, in the Battle of Ain Jalut, which was an entirely Mongol affair, where the Mongols were defeated by the Egyptian-based Mamluks. Now, we've avoided talking about Artsakh because we really don't know much until the reign of Hassan Jalal, who reigned from 1215 to 1261. So now this is the right time to talk about him because we moved into the 13th century. Hassan Jalal was a builder of the largest monastery in Artsakh region, that which is the region Khachen, which he controlled, which was Ganzasar Monastery. And Ganzasar became the Catholicos of the Albanian Church. Now, of course, as we pointed out, the Albanian Church was subordinated to the Armenian Church by this period, and so we have numerous carvings across the church in Armenian writing. And we also have recognition, for example, on his flag, the flag of Khachen. We have the Armenian alphabet, and it's notable because Meshrab Mashtots, the person who we talked about invented the Armenian alphabet, he also invented an Albanian alphabet. So if it had been written in Albanian, it would be in Albanian letters. Now, Hassan Jalal was the last remaining Armenian leader of a free, independent Armenian state, other than those in Cilicia. Certainly the only independent Armenian leader in the lands of historic Armenia. And he petitioned the Mongols repeatedly for a vassal state, and he managed to get that until 1261, when he met with Arghun, who was head of the Mongol Ilkhanate, that was the Persian Mongol Empire, and they imprisoned him, tortured him, and hacked him to pieces. But his descendants created a dynasty of rulers of this region called the Hassan Jalalian dynasty, and they continued to rule until the mid-1600s. Now, despite the fact that they continued to rule, this mountainous region divided into 5 separate kingdoms, and that's where this term Melikdom comes from, Melik being king, right? So these were 5 independent kingdoms, and you can see them on the map here: Gulistan, Draraberd, Khachen, Varand, and Dizak. And these 5 Melikdoms together were roughly analogous to the territory of Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Oblast, which you can see in black placed on top of it, even though that it's anachronous for the time period. Now, when Timur comes in, Timur engages in numerous massacres of the local Armenian population when he conquers Greater Armenia. As far as I know, he doesn't actually go to Armenian Cilicia, but Armenian Cilicia by this point had been conquered by the Mamluks, who by the mid-1300s had taken over large swaths of territory, and Tamerlane was coming at the beginning of the 1400s. So once Armenian Cilicia was defeated in 1375, the only Armenian state that survived was the 5 Melikdoms, which were incredibly weak. And to the degree that they were independent, we also have to recognize that they were paying tribute to whoever was ruling in Persia. And that would keep changing, right? Because the Ilkhanate was replaced by the Chopanids. The Chopanids were replaced by Timur. Timur was replaced by the Safavids, by the Black Sheep Turks and the White Sheep Turks. So they would keep paying whoever these sovereigns were, but they didn't have complete and total independence, but they had a significant degree of independence. And in Khachen, because they had independence, Christianity was the dominant religion of the region. Elsewhere in this area, in the historic area of Armenia and in Cilicia, Islam is now the dominant religion, politically speaking. And you can see on this map, the area that used to belong to Cilicia is now controlled by the Ramazanid Turkic state. So when we have this period where the Armenians are no longer a political force in any meaningful sense, we begin to see the creation of new Catholicosates that somehow bridge the divide between where Armenian Cilicia was and where Greater Armenia is. And so the area around Lake Von in particular becomes sort of a focal point of Armenian cultural life to the extent that it continues to exist. And so we have the Catholicos Zakaria III. That is not an actual picture of that Catholicos, but it's a picture of one of his successors. Catholicos Zakaria III really brings life to Akhtamar. Akhtamar being one of the islands inside of Lake Von. You can see the mountains surrounding the lake from the monastery. You can see on the left-hand side. And Akhtamar becomes a center of Armenian cultural life. We have numerous texts being written and translated here. We have art, almost all of it ecclesiastical art coming out of Akhtamar. And the Armenian community is primarily defined either religiously through its connection to the church or through its position relative to the Ottoman government. Because increasingly the Ottoman government is taking over these areas, especially as we get into the mid 1400s. When we look at we also begin to see large numbers of disruptions in Armenian communal life that occur as tangential effects of larger scale disunities within the Ottoman Empire. And we haven't gotten to this yet on the Ottoman Empire side, but I'll discuss it more there when we do. We have the Jalali revolts, which occur throughout Eastern Anatolia. And these revolts are revolts by Turkic leaders for a variety of different reasons against the Ottoman sultans. And these are Muslim on Muslim wars. They don't involve the Armenians in terms of them having a stake in which side is winning. The Armenians not supporting one side over the other, but it happens that almost all of these revolts happen in areas where Armenians are densely packed and highly populous. And so Armenians suffer immensely because of these Jalali revolts, creating a lot of havoc in the area. It's important to also note that we've shifted from arrows and crossbows to musket loading rifles. So the number of casualties from these encounters and also artillery batteries. So the numbers of deaths from these encounters is increasingly high, especially since many of the Jalali who were involved in these revolts had been part of the Ottoman Janissary Corps or had been another part of the Ottoman military. So they had access to advanced weaponry, and it was not just small localized revolts. We also see that deportation is alive and well in the Ottoman Empire. It's the same policy as the Byzantines did. When Mehmet II conquered Constantinople in 1453, there was an Armenian community there, but a very small one. And Mehmet II also noticed that the city had a population capacity of about 500,000 people, but only about 50,000 were living in the city, which meant that there were large sections that were empty. And as he wanted to turn this into his capital, he deported populations from all around the Armenian Empire, all around the Ottoman Empire to Constantinople, including the Armenians, Greeks, and Jews. And eventually he appointed to lead the Armenian community Millet Bashi, or the head of the millet or group, and that was Hovakim I. So just a few points. Then you had the rise of the Black Sheep Turks, and while you had some like Kara Yusuf and Jahan Shah who were very positive influences on the Armenians, you had between them Kara Iskender, who performed numerous Armenian massacres. With the rise of the Safavids and the Safavid expansion over almost all of territorial Armenia, you had increasing repression against the Armenians then. And this resulted in a large Armenian exodus from the region, which is why there are Armenian communities now in the Low Countries. And you can see this is actually a painting from Flemish artists about 400 years ago, showing the Armenian community in Bruges, among all other local Low Country people. Both the Safavids and the Ottomans, when they went to war with each other, went to war in the territory of of historic Armenia, and the Safavids in particular pursued a scorched earth policy, destroying all of the land in advance of the Ottomans taking it, which ruined Armenia for the local population that was living there. We also know that these conflicts went back and forth a number of times, especially in the 16th century, with the city of Yerevan today being conquered and unconquered 26 times, which was incredibly difficult. All right. The last sort of note is that, as I mentioned before, the Safavids began to attack Armenia and enslave Armenians to bring into their Kurtshi system, which was they were forcibly converted to Islam and made the royal guards in opposition to the Kizilbash. We talked about this more during the Safavid presentation. There were wars throughout Armenia in the Safavid period, and the most deadly, of course, was that in 1604, where Shah Abbas relocated the city of Julfa, which was an Armenian city in what's now Azerbaijan, and he relocated the population to Isfahan. Significant percentages of Armenians died en route. They couldn't ford the river Aras, and it was in the middle of the winter in the high mountains. You can imagine the conditions. The Armenians that did make it were resettled in Isfahan and do remain there to this day. You can see the Armenian cathedral in Isfahan in the upper right-hand side. And Armenians continued to contribute to the Safavid Empire when they were there. You can see Khachatur Kasaratsi, who was an Armenian based in Isfahan, who was the first Safavid to use a printing press, person in the Safavid Empire to use a printing press. And Armenians, because of their Christian nature and because of stretching across multiple countries, were able to be interlocutors in large-scale trade along the Silk Road between Safavid Persia and the Ottoman Empire without arousing the suspicions of either, while Sunni or Shiite Muslims would respectively be a problem in the country of the other. And that's my spiel for tonight. So any last questions before we sort of wrap up? Okay, I guess everybody's asleep. Next week in this series, we're going to go back to our normal trajectory, which will cover Suleiman the Magnificent, who was Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, and that will be at 7 p.m. Eastern Time next Tuesday. Zach, do you want to make any announcements?
Richard, I have a couple questions. How did you get
absolutely.
started learning about this history? And then how long will the series run till? Like what will some future topics? You said at the beginning this was one of many that you've done. Like what will be some other ones that'll be coming up in the future?
Sure. Just give me a second. I have a list. But generally speaking, my goal is to get to the 21st century and sort of track the development of the Middle East up till now.
Okay, awesome.
Which is a lot of ground to cover, because as we move closer and closer to the modern era, there's much more going on in a lot shorter amount of time. So I'm going to sorry, just give me a second. Let me share my screen. So this started from the beginning, and this is the series as it started in 2022. So we have the Safavids, ancient Armenia, medieval Armenia, which is today. Then we have Suleiman next week, the Sultanate of Women after him, the Caprilu Viziers, which is when Albanians ruled the Ottoman Empire, the wars with Russia, Balkan nationalism, because that has a huge effect on the Middle East, even though it's technically outside of the Middle East. Then we're going to talk about the Mamluks in Egypt and Napoleon's invasion of Egypt, and leading to the Albanian Khedivate. Then we're going to talk about Ottoman Syria, the Kurds, Ottoman Iraq, Hotakis and Afsharids, which is the next empire in Iran, Qajar Iran, which follows the Afsharids. The 19th century Turkish history, such as Ottomanism and young Turkish revolutions, the Balkan Wars and Albanian independence, the Ottoman collapse and the Armenian genocide, the Turkish War of Independence, the Wars of the Caucasus, which is when we come back to Armenia, of course. Well, the Armenian genocide and the Caucasian Wars, we come back to Armenia, the Turkish Republic, the decline of the Qajars and Reza Shah Pahlavi, post-World War I Middle East, then the British Imperial Middle East, French Imperial Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Arab liberalism, ethnic nationalism, Arab nationalism, all these kinds of political movements, Islamism and jihadism, Zionism, World War I, and the Arab-Israeli conflict. Somebody's asking when the Armenian genocide is. I mean, the date is tentative. It's going to be in March. It's going to be in May sometime. But these things always get pushed back because if the presentation is too long, or we get too excited or whatever, or things could happen in people's schedules, and so the dates might be pushed back. But it's
okay, no, that's no problem. What about how many of the? Well, let me ask you a question, but before you answer it, let me elaborate why I'm asking. How many of these do you have the exact date and like the description written out? The reason I asked is because what I found out, like for our group, it may not be universal for all meetups, but for our group, we get the most signups if we post events between like 2 and 4 weeks in advance. So if you had the dates and the descriptions, I could post these on our meetup group, and then you get more people. Because this one, I know it was kind of a last minute deal.
As I said, I'll send you the links. I have everything up to the Balkan nationalism, which puts us
awesome.
March 1st.
Because the last the one we did last week,
they're all up on Meetup. I'll send you the links to the individual pages.
Okay, no, that's awesome. Okay, terrific.
Yeah, I try to schedule them a month out.
Okay, no, that's perfect. Because I told a few people this one, or the last week I told a few people. This one I told more, and then next time I can tell even more.
Yeah, no, I'm so happy that so many people came and that people really enjoyed it. You asked me
when you're all done, you'll have. I know they're on YouTube, but when you're all done, you'll have to download them and put them on a DVD.
I don't think they'll fit, honestly. Right? I mean, like right now, I've already
it'll be like it could be like a 4 DV set, like Ken Burns does.
Yeah, exactly. But in terms of where I got my interest from, I'm an Iraqi Jew. This is my neighborhood. These are.
Oh, I see. Excellent.
This is a world that I understand, and I feel like I understand in a way that a lot of Americans around me don't understand it, and they don't. And it's sad because they see it sort of as this place where everybody's trying to kill everybody, and there is some truth in that. But you could say the same of Europe 200 years ago. And nobody would say, why would you study European history from the 1800s? Like, why would you care? And I like to enjoy what these people brought to bear and how they thought and what they wanted, and they're just like everybody else.
One of my teachers at the University of Michigan back a long time ago, Dennis Papazian, he was an Armenian, and I took one of his classes, and he was really interesting. And he used to talk about the fact that it's disappointing more Americans don't know about this history of the whole entire Eastern Europe. People, Americans, they know more about English history or French history if they know anything about the history of Europe, but not so much the Eastern European history. So he's I don't believe he's alive anymore, but if he was here, he'd be really flattered and honored that you're teaching all these people about this history and sharing all your knowledge with us. So because he was a big proponent of people learning more about the history outside the United States.
Yeah, no, and look, the American history is a very interesting vehicle, but I think there are a lot of people who are better suited to explaining that than I am, right?
Oh yeah, no, I think I love American history, but that being said, we should know what's going on in the rest of the world.
I'm saying, like, right? Like I have a choice about like what I can talk about and
Mhm.
what I can say,
Mhm.
and I do know quite a bit about American history. But the thing is that since there are so many people who have such a good grasp of American history and can explain it to Americans in a way that other Americans can understand, I don't really see the value add for me, right, to
Mhm.
talk about those kinds of things. I see the value add here because this is a world that most Americans don't know, don't understand, and have no idea about how to find out how to understand.
Right. Oh, okay. No, that I think you're doing a great job and appreciate you taking the time. I've really learned a lot listening to you these past 2 weeks. So I really appreciate it. And I know there's a lot of other similar comments from the people that have been doing it
Yeah,
as well.
thank you guys so much.
So let's see. So if anyone else has any questions for Richard, please let us know before we sign off for the night and let him enjoy the rest of his evening. Yeah, we're doing so Richard's going to be doing a talk about a 4-part series on the Crusades. It's going to kick off on February 19th. We haven't put it on the calendar just yet. We'll probably do that in the next few days. I was tied up doing some other stuff. But yeah, that'll be on our calendar in the next few days. I'll email that information out to everyone. And Richard can teach us all
Yeah.
about the Crusades. That will be another fascinating topic.
Yeah, no, a lot of the stuff here where we talked about Armeno-Crusader relations, we were sort of touching on things that I sort of assumed that people who had been in the series for a while would have been familiar with because there were those episodes in the past. But there's a lot of detail that I really didn't discuss here because it's not relevant to the Armenian story.
Mhm.
It's much more relevant to the Crusaders story or to I don't know what you want to say, the Muslims who opposed the Crusaders story.
Uh-huh.
And the way that I scheduled that what with Robert was to make it a 90-minute session, so it's um a little bit more contained, and it's 4 episodes. I think, Robert, I think I sent you the 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 explanation of
Yep.
what
Yeah, you
every
sure
session is
did.
going to
Yep.
be.
I have that ready to
And
go. And I
yeah,
just hadn't posted yet because like I said, for us the sweet spot's been like 2 to 4 weeks,
yeah,
but
no,
we're
that's
up at
fine.
that now. So get it on the calendar and we're gonna start moving forward.
Yeah, no, that's
The
fantastic.
Crusades is such a great idea for a topic because that's something, in my opinion, most Americans have heard of the Crusade. They know maybe like the basic, 1 or 2 sentences of what it was all about. But as far as the details, don't really probably know much about it, including myself. So it'd be really fascinating to learn about that. So that's really a great topic. Really appreciate you coming up with that idea.
No, like the thing is that the Crusades is about 200 years worth of wars and states, and so there were people who were born, gave birth to children, died, and their children lived in crusader states like that was their life.
Hmm.
They it's not just like the war in Iraq where we were in for what, 8 years and then we're out. Like this was a massive population change, um a huge personal endeavor, and you have really funny stories that happen. Like there are cases where a woman on the street would be yelling something. She'd be a Christian and she'd be yelling something at a Muslim, and the Muslim would just throw up his hands because she was speaking a language from some far-flung area of Europe, and he didn't speak that.
Uh-huh.
Like, what was she trying to tell him? And there would start to be mobs in the street, and then people would have to be like, just calm down, and like somebody would have to figure out what language she was speaking, what dialect of what thing, because of course languages weren't standardized in Europe either. So what was it? French? What kind of French? Was it German? What kind of German? And try and figure out what dispute it was. And it was over, like somebody forgot to pay for an apple or something, right? So like it's just a natural part of people's lives that's how things were. And so people sort of don't see that. They just see sort of the soundbite on the media of like, it's another crusade, we're invading the Middle East. And it's like, no, it's not. It's
I'll
it's
have to
it's
track it
something.
down. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was gonna say it's something, but it's not that.
I'll have to track it down because it was like 5 years ago. But the guy that runs our book discussion group, he picked a book one month that was the Crusades from the Muslim perspective, and it was that we had a really fascinating discussion on that. But I'll have to go and track down the name of
Yeah.
that book and
No,
send it
I
to you and
mean,
see if that's one you're familiar with.
I mean, the thing is that my presentations tend to be the Middle Eastern perspective on
Hmm.
X. So, to the extent that the Crusades are something that happens in Europe, and I do address this, um, I'm not really that interested in what's going on in the Crusades in Europe. I mentioned it, I discussed it, but what's really important to me is, okay, now these people have arrived in Jerusalem. These people have arrived in Tyre. These people have arrived in Edessa. These people have arrived in Antioch. What are they doing now?
Hmm.
Like, how are they organized? Who is supporting whom? Um, what like one of the things I forgot to mention today is that in the siege of Antioch, the major break for the Crusaders was that there was an Armenian Mamluk, right, a forcibly converted Armenian who was Muslim, who was really just pissed at his boss. His boss, Yaxian, had refused to pay him his commission and didn't allow him to take the woman that he wanted. Sorry, Yaxian slept with his wife. That's what it was. Yaxian slept with his wife and he didn't pay him the proper commission. So he turns around to the Crusaders and says, "Here's a rope. Climb the wall." So you like, and like, it's just a human. It's a human story, right? It's
Hmm.
not like there was some epic showdown of philosophical doctrine. No, it's a normal person living a normal life, and they're pissed at their boss, and so they're like, you know what? Screw you.
Have they ever made like any? I can't think of any off the top of my head, but I'm not as familiar with the. I'm a modern historian kind of guy, but have they made any like Hollywood films about the Crusades? Like
The one
Charlton Heston,
No, the one that I like is Kingdom of Heaven. Now there
Kingdom
are
of Heaven. Oh,
many,
okay.
yeah,
Let me
with
write that down.
Orlando Bloom.
Oh,
There are
okay.
many inaccuracies in that film. Most notoriously is that Orlando Bloom's character is sort of like they have him being born in Europe in order to create that sort of entryway for the viewer to sort of come to Jerusalem with him. Um, but the actual character that he plays, that historical person, was actually born in Jerusalem. Like that,
Oh,
like
okay.
he lived there all his life. And there are some things like Reynald de Chatillon is just like the super villain, even though like he's a problem, but in reality, but um there are some skewings, but I think if you want to get a sense of what does internal politics look like in the Crusader states from a Hollywood perspective, as opposed to some boring person droning on for a while, that would be the movie Kingdom of Heaven.
What about so for someone who's maybe not familiar with the Crusades, would you recommend them watching that film before they tune into your program, or would that be better to watch after they've heard your talks? What are your thoughts on that?
Um, if they want to watch beforehand, that can definitely clear up some of the misunderstandings.
Okay, because I could put
But
that in the event descriptions, tell people like, hey, it's not really related to our program, but FYI, if you want to watch this movie,
yeah,
and
no,
Richard
that
may
no,
reference it during his talk.
yeah, yeah, that'd be great.
Oh, okay,
Um,
yeah, I can do that.
yeah, I mean the thing is just like put an asterisk note that this film has numerous historical inaccuracies, but it does paint a picture of what the conflicts were at the time, who the different parties were involved in this.
Oh, okay. Okay, no, that's no problem. I'll be happy to set that up. So,
Yeah.
okay, all right. Well, that's awesome. What about anybody else have any questions or comments before we sign off? There was a question from Phyllis, if she's still on.
I mean, even if she's not still on, I can still answer it.
It says, I wonder if there can be a thematic statement for a given period of the Armenian history to tie the events together for those who are completely ignorant of this history.
Sure. I would say that there are sort of three ages of Armenian history. The first age is um, creating an Armenian identity, and that's really the ancient period. We saw that with Bianili, we saw that with the satrapy period. Then starting with the Orontids in 321 BC until about, let's say, 1200 to 1300, yeah, 1300. So from 321 BC until about 1300, you have the Armenian states period, which is where Armenia goes through different periods there are different kingdoms that rise or fall, vassal states, other sorts of regions, but there's always some sort of collective Armenian political entity to a certain degree. And then once you get past the year 1300, then you sort of get from 1300 until the end of the Soviet Union, really, where Armenians don't have a political voice. And Armenians are sort of at the whim of whatever conquering power controls historic Armenia and controls Armenian Cilicia. So those are really the themes, right? Is that, and now, of course, you have this fourth theme that sort of has developed in the last 30, 40 years of Armenian independence. And what does it mean for Armenians to now go back to having their own country, where their country is not the most powerful country in the region, which is where it was in the second period, right? Armenia was, with the exception of King Tigranes the Great, Armenia was never the most powerful country in its entourage of neighbors, and it always had to play its neighbors against each other, and it always had to use smart diplomacy in order to stay afloat, and that's what Armenia today has to do. And so it's a very difficult position for Armenia to be in.
Okay. All right. Awesome. Well, I think that's a wrap for tonight or today, depending on what part of the world people are joining us from. So again, thank you. Anything else from anybody before we wrap up?
I have a note that says it's amazing how thoroughly Western Christianity has managed to divorce its history from Eastern Europe and the Middle East. And I'd say I agree. I think
Oh yeah.
Once the Catholic Church split from Eastern Orthodoxy, they really, at least in my view, reinvented Christianity as being a Western European, a Western Roman phenomenon. And so we don't see the veneration of people coming out of the East. We don't see a lot of focus in Western European history on some kind of rapprochement between Catholics and the Orthodoxies. We do see a lot about rapprochement between Catholics and Protestants, because that's a huge part of Western European history, right? The Protestant revolutions and things like that. But yeah, the Catholics managed to sort of write the Orthodoxies out of the history books, and and I think that's just sort of a issue of locality.
Okay. All right. Well, awesome. I have to sign up, or I have to sign off. I mean, sorry. I don't know if anybody else is going to stick around. Are you all squared away, Richard?
I'm squared away. I'm about to leave.
Okay. Awesome. Well, thank you. We will see you next time. And again, thanks so much for taking the time out to walk us through and educate on this fascinating topic. Look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you so much, everybody, for coming to listen. And I really appreciate it. All right.
Okay. Awesome. No, the appreciation is all ours, Richard. Thank you.
All right. Bye.
Take care.